You spent a lot of time with Gene Cernan, the last man on the moon, a charming, lovely man. I met him actually at the premiere of your film as well. They definitely went to the moon. Let's just clear that one up for Leilani, right? They went. And how do you feel he would be thinking now? Because sadly, he passed away a few years ago. What would he and those other astronauts be thinking about NASA finally going back into space?
Well, he'd be very excited, for sure. And he'd be very curious to see how they did it. And he'd be a little annoyed that there are mannequins going. But because, he was one of the guys that went up there and was able to tell his story. For me, he campaigned very hard to try and get astronauts back on the moon again. In 1972, when he ended when they ended the missions there, he didn't think it would be this long before anything would ever go back there. So, of course, as mentioned earlier, money is a big issue. It's a massive cost. But we are a curious being. And, Everest, we climbed the top of Everest and we keep doing it. And it's dangerous. And it's, all sorts of reasons why you shouldn't do it. But as the human being is a very curious animal. And we will always try and stretch and find new places.
Because one thing that came out when I watched that film and talking to Gene as well was that he was slightly angry and annoyed with NASA, all the sort of sacrifices. And I mean, my God, they'd never have got off the ground now with all the health and safety checks they had. But they did. They were brave pioneers and off they went and people died along the way. But they kept on going. And then it all stopped. It was meant to be Apollo 20, but they stopped it 3 early, didn't they? Because of the sort of public not having an appetite. They thought it was too much money. He was slightly angry, and so were the other guys as well, thinking, so what do we do it for? Was that certainly a feeling he still had in your conversations?
Very much so. I mean, he was irritated by it because he really didn't want to be the last man on the moon. He said, "I don't want to be the last man on the moon. I want somebody else to be up there." He wanted a woman up on the moon. He was very clear about that. He said, "We've got a lot more to do up there. We haven't finished." You see these images showing now of people walking on the moon, men walking on the moon. Like you said earlier, the technology to take those pictures and send them back were pretty ropey. I would be very curious to see what comes back from the moon. I would hope, however, Gene Cernan wrote the initials of his daughter, Tracy, on the moon. So I hope they land far enough away not to blow them away.
Well, look, let's chat to Martin Rees as well. What do you think, Martin? Are you excited? I mean, you must be thrilled, not excited, about going back into space.
Yes, well, I am, and I should say I met Harrison Schmitt, who was the other person who landed on Apollo 17, and I completely agree with what's been said. I think the point I would make, which you already made, was that NASA's become much more risk-averse. And these heroes of Apollo were taking high risks, but NASA's not prepared to take risks. To give an example, the space shuttle was launched 135 times, and there were 2 crashes, which killed the 7-member crew on each occasion, and they were each traumatic for the Americans. They stopped the program for 3 years. And that therefore means that the American public is not prepared for publicly funded civilians to accept the kind of risks which are getting necessary in these voyages. So my take, and I advertise my new book called The End of Astronauts, is that we should have programs of unmanned exploration using robots, which are much better, of course, than they were 50 years ago, and can not only do exploration, but they can build structures on the moon or in space. So we have them, but we should, for the reasons we all know, the wish for adventure, etc., we should have private ventures into space and with humans. And I say private because the billionaires can take higher risks than NASA can.
Well, you've seen, of
they can
course,
launch
SpaceX and Amazon going into space. I mean, I'm hoping, praying on Monday, and seen images now, that the NASA one doesn't look like the giant penis that obviously Amazon send up into space, the cock rocket, as they called it. I mean, it was slightly embarrassing shape, wasn't it? Let's be honest.
Right, but well, rockets tend to be that shape, don't they? But I think, but I think private space flight, and of course SpaceX has rockets which are fully a match for the one that's going to go up on Monday. They can launch, I think, more cheaply, but more cheaply mainly because they can launch the kind of people like the early Apollo astronauts, like Sir Ranulph Fiennes, like the people who go hang gliding and round the world ballooning and that sort of thing, who are prepared to accept the risks. And we should cheer them on, and the taxpayers don't pay. So my view is NASA and ESA should support rockets and the robots, but the human flight should be left to the billionaires and sponsors who can launch people prepared to accept higher risks.
Let's bring Mark Thompson into this conversation, if we could. So, Mark, welcome along to the show. Nice to have you on. How are you feeling about Monday?
Do you know what? I'm so excited. I missed being the young age that I am. I missed the moon landings, the Apollo era. So yeah, I'm very excited to see humans going back to the moon. And I'd echo what the other two guys are saying, that there's so much more that humans can do in space. Certainly, robotic exploration is incredibly important. And since the Apollo missions back in the 60s and 70s, there have been hundreds of robotic missions that have gone out to all the planets now in the solar system. And with the development of artificial intelligence, with virtual reality, and all the other new technologies that have come along of late, robots are far more capable of exploring and doing the job of a human being. So absolutely, I think robotic exploration is far better where there's high levels of risk, but it's also very difficult to quash that human drive and desire to go into space. So I'm also very, very pleased to see that happening.
Yeah, I mean, look, back in 1969, I mean, it's the one single event that actually managed to unite the world, didn't it? As the world was literally gasping and in awe watching those two grainy little men jumping around on the moon in 1969. I mean, it blew us all away. I mean, nowadays, the world is in turmoil at the moment. Do you think space exploration and sort of a mission like this, particularly when they send men back to the moon, will manage to have that uniting effect, that the world will once again look up? This time, of course, we'll be looking up in HD, so it'll look like a film. I think there was something rather lovely and romantic about those grainy images, because it made you feel like it was a long way away. When I saw the SpaceX mission and it was like watching a video game, it was kind of like, it felt slightly anticlimactic to me, even though I knew it was unbelievable. And I think, do you think it'll have that same uniting effect? Will it blow us all away again, a new generation? Mark?
Do you know, I think it's really interesting. If you look back at the Apollo era, you know, that one of the real key drivers of the moon shot from NASA was about political power, and it was about one-upmanship on other countries, and it was very much a race between the Americans and the Russians to be the first country to put people on the moon. But thankfully, I think generally there's much more collaboration. You've only got to look at the International Space Station, which is lots of countries working together to put a permanent base up in space. So I think absolutely, I think by and large there's an awful lot more international cooperation. And I think as well, something that we get from human exploration in space is inspiration. And the Apollo missions inspired thousands, millions of kids and grown-ups also to look to the skies and to wonder at the universe, and also get interested in science. And we've seen how important science is. So anything that's going to inspire future generations of scientists, you know, in my book, is a good thing.